I am Karen Taylor, Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York. I am delighted to welcome both our online and our in-person audience this evening. And I particularly want to thank our in-person audience. As you probably know, today is not the best of days, and we really appreciate the effort you've made to come out this evening. So thank you so much. We have had the pleasure to partner with New York Landmarks Conservancy over a number of years on landmark topics. But tonight is particularly special as we have this evening the opportunity to celebrate 50 years of the New York Landmarks Conservancy. Happy birthday, New York Landmarks Conservancy. Tonight, through our wonderful speaker, Peg Breen, we will be covering its distinguished history and mission, as well as its absolutely vital and invaluable work for preservation in New York City. For those of you who are less familiar with the General Society, a brief introduction. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York is a non-profit organization that was founded in 1785 by 22 skilled craftsmen. Today, our 238-year-old organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life of the people of the City of New York through our educational and cultural programs. These include our General Society Library, of which, of course, we are in this evening, our John M. Mossman Locke Museum, which is upstairs and you're welcome to have a look at afterwards, our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, and finally, our General Society Lecture Series, a lecture series that was originally started in 1838. For our online audience, please feel free to submit typed questions throughout the lecture through the Q&A section, and of course, at the conclusion of the talk. We would ask that you use the Q&A section rather than raise your hand, or the chat section. For the in-person audience, we ask that you hold off on your questions until the conclusion of the talk. Peg Breen, the New York Landmarks Conservancy President, as I mentioned, will lead the talk this evening on the Conservatory's history and mission. Peg Breen joined the New York Landmarks Conservancy, one of the oldest and largest preservation organizations in the country, after careers in public television and government. She has expanded the Conservancy's loan and grant programs that help owners restore and maintain their historic buildings. She was deeply involved after 9/11 in efforts to identify and save original elements of the World Trade Center, including the survivor's staircase that is now featured in the 9/11 Museum. She's currently involved in efforts to defeat the state's plan to level blocks of Midtown Manhattan round Penn Station. And of course, I think all of us here will wish the Conservancy great success in that project. The US State Department sent her abroad to discuss preservation in St. Petersburg, Russia, Vancouver, Canada, and Tilbury, Georgia. She was keynote speaker at an international preservation conference in Havana, Cuba, and led a workshop on restoring religious properties with CNCREM, a national Cuban preservation organization. Peg Breen is on the boards of Save Ellis Island and the International African American Museum in Charleston, South Carolina. It is my huge pleasure to introduce to you Peg Breen. Thank you, Peg.
'50 doesn't sound too old when you're in this place after 237 years, but so we'll all be back when we're 237 years and we'll have another lecture. I'm delighted to be here this evening, and I do thank you all so much for coming out in the weather for this. The Landmarks Conservancy was founded in 1973 by a group from the Municipal Art Society. And when we were founded, the Landmarks Commission, the city's agency, was all of 8 years old. But even then, people realized that landmarking alone wouldn't always save a building. So they wanted a group totally devoted to preservation with some technical capacity to actually help people save their buildings through easements, through the loan and grant programs that we eventually founded, and to be able to stick with multi-year preservation projects, because you really have to be in this business for the long haul. And so we were formed, and we've had 50 wonderful years. And as part of our anniversary celebration, we created an online exhibition called 50 for 50, which is on our website. And these are 50 of the more than 1,000 buildings that our loans and grants have helped save. And we've now given out almost $62 million in loans and grants to preserve all kinds of structures. And we pared down, you're not going to look at 50 buildings. I'm not going to make you sit through that. I've pared them down to some of my favorites. And we'll take a tour through the boroughs and not only see what we've done, but hear about their stories. As I love to tell people, we don't do this because we have a brick fetish. You know, we probably like bricks more than most people, but we do it for the people who own the buildings, visit the buildings, worship in the buildings, and for the great sense of history and that the buildings in New York give you. This is the greatest collection of architecture of any city in the country. And it is the layers of history that give us our richness and give us our identity. And that's what we're here to try to protect. So here we go. This was our first ever building, the Cass Gilbert's monumental custom house at the tip of Manhattan and Bowling Green. He built it in 1907. It was his first commission in New York. And this was when the federal government got its income from goods on ships, goods coming into America. And we were the largest port, so we wound up with, at that point, the largest custom house. And my office actually looks down on this building, and I go by it every day, and there's always something else to see because it's just so magnificent. But the federal government has this amazing habit of walking out and abandoning their property. So just about the time we were formed, they went out and left this building vacant. And at Lower Manhattan was still the center then of lawyers and bankers. There was even an office of Lower Manhattan in the mayor's office. So there was a great group of people who wanted to do something to save this building. And among those were attorneys from Simpson Thacher, who we still have on their descendants on the board, and Senator Moynihan, who was always a great friend of the Conservancy. So we held exhibitions in there. We asked different stores if they wanted, we asked Saks if they wanted to open a branch in Lower Manhattan. We had I.M. Pei look at this, and he designed residences even back then. We held a big dinner and gave an award to Ada Louise Huxtable with the Architectural League. But one of our board members was on the board of a Native American museum in Upper Manhattan, around 155th Street, and nobody ever went up there in those days. A few people still go up there. So he worked with Senator Moynihan and got the exhibition moved. Most of it went to Washington, which was the core collection now in the American Indian Museum in Washington. And a part of the collection came here, and this is now a branch of the Smithsonian. And as that happened, the federal government became interested in the building again and filled out the top floors with offices. So it's an absolutely gorgeous building on the interior too, and I really urge you to visit. But now we're off to Staten Island. Frederick Law Olmsted lived in this house for several years, beginning in 1848. The house itself dates to the late 1600s. When he was there, it was a 130-acre farm, and he began his experimentation with landscape architecture when he lived here. Trees he planted are still on the grounds. The family who lived in the house in 2006 sold it to the city. And the city created a park encompassing the grounds. We paid for a condition survey at the time, and the building was in very good shape. So we thought things were fine until a few years ago when I started getting phone calls from photographers, basically, who were wandering around Staten Island. And as you see, the no trespassing sign was up. The grounds had been totally neglected. And the porch that was once on the house when he lived there had fallen off. It was a disgrace. So I called the then Parks Commissioner and said, we'd love to work with them to help the house. And that particular commissioner was not interested. So we put out an alert to Olmsted groups all across the country to have them email parks and say they had to do something about the house. So 2 days later, the commissioner graciously agreed to let us raise money to take care of this building. And we've since put in $200,000 to stabilize it. We've done a lot of waterproofing. We've shored up floorboards. We are now in the process of fixing some windows and fixing the electrical system, actually, so that you can see in there a bit better. We are working with the Parks Department from Staten Island. They've cleaned up the grounds. There's a wonderful Friends group that does a lot of programming about Olmsted and his time on Staten Island. And eventually we want to see this open to the public and a part of the Historic House Trust, but there's still a long ways to go. This is one of my favorite historic houses. It's the Alice Austin House on Staten Island. This was also a Dutch home initially. The oldest part of this is 1690, and Alice's grandfather bought it in 1844 and expanded into this charming Victorian cottage, which he named Clear Comfort. And it sits on this beautiful rise on the harbor, and you can see the harbor to the right and into Manhattan on the left. During Sandy, water didn't get up this far, but the grounds were so soaked that Alice's glass plates, which were in the basement, were getting damp. So we paid to get them moved to safe storage. And earlier we've paid to fix the roof. But it's a charming place. Alice, who is on a pole here, you can see her perched with her camera, was one of the country's earliest female photographers. There was family money. She traveled in Europe. She was a member of the Cosmopolitan Club. So she wasn't taken seriously. But she was incredibly plucky. And there were immigration stations on various islands before Ellis Island opened. She was out there taking pictures. She took pictures of a vanishing Staten Island, which was really a summer retreat for a lot of people. And she went to Lower Manhattan and did a lot of street life. Alice lost the home eventually. And Alice in recent years has become a favorite of the LGBTQ community. She had a long relationship with the woman standing there with a scarf on her head. And when she lost the home, she wound up in a home for the poor on Staten Island. And a couple of years later, a man wanted to use some of her photographs in his magazine, a publisher, and he discovered Alice was alive. So he went to the home and found her there and paid her enough money for her pictures, and her pictures became popular again and other people used them, so that she could have a comfortable life in a nursing home. And the neighbors rallied around to save Clear Comfort. And it's just a treasure. And her photographs are a treasure as well. Now we're in Queens. And here's another Dutch house that was built in 1661. And the family, the Bound family, lived here 300 years. Think of that in New York City, 300 years in one house. And it became a museum in 1947. John Bound was a Quaker and held Quaker meetings in this house. And Peter Stuyvesant at one point banned Quaker meetings. So Bown went to the Dutch West India Company himself personally to plead for more freedom of religion. The Dutch West India Company didn't care about religion, they cared about commerce. So they told Peter Stuyvesant to stand down. And Bown came back and he helped establish religious tolerance. It's called the Flushing Remonstrance, and it is seen as the precursor of our First Amendment. His descendants included abolitionists and a mayor of New York. And we have advised this house for almost 300 years ourselves. There are regular tours here now in Flushing. This is the oldest synagogue in Queens, Tifereth Israel. It was founded by Eastern European Jews and built in 1911, and Estee Lauder of cosmetics fame worshipped here as a child. It was vacant for several years, and in recent years has been home to Bukharan Jews. We have a sacred sites program that helps landmark religious institutions all over the state. And this was one of our longest running projects. Queens is the borough of immigrants. So the Queensborough president at the time and all the elected officials were really pleased to discover the oldest synagogue in Queens. They put in money, we put in money, the state put in money, and we restored the exterior. We had a big celebration inside, and some of the individuals who gave us money encouraged us to continue. We usually work just on the exterior of buildings, but with help from individuals, we put in a new heater and electrical system. And so we celebrate it all over again. And now we're up in the Bronx. This is Gould Memorial. It's considered Stanford White's masterpiece. And he created it in 1900 for what was once the uptown campus of NYU. It's now Bronx Community College. We're on a committee formed by White's great-grandson, Sam White, who I saw come in, who's sitting amongst us tonight. It could no longer serve as a library, but it is an absolutely gorgeous building, Connemara marble. There's an active auditorium in the basement that always kept it in some use, but it's just not functioning well as a library. And there's a wonderful modern library by Robert A.M. Stern there now. But Sam formed a group to try to get interest in restoring it. He's been successful. It has a new roof, and we gave it a grant to help move the heavy bronze doors that got stuck at one point. It's now Bronx Community College has students from like 60 countries around the world, and it has amazing architecture. So it is really wonderful that the college is dedicated to the building now and seeking new uses so other students can enjoy it. And now this is St. Anselm and St. Roch, also in the Bronx. It was built in 1894, and it's a rare example of Byzantine architecture in the city. It's modeled after the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul and has amazing iconography on the interior. It's a real New York story, because here we are looking at an Istanbul-inspired church, but it was founded by German monks for an Irish congregation. It's now mostly Hispanic, and we have given them money to restore their wonderful roofs. And now we're in Brooklyn. And this is Erasmus Hall Academy. It was built in 1786 as the first secondary school in New York State. And it was for young gentlemen. And Alexander Hamilton, Burr, John Jay, Edward Livingston, and other founding fathers put up the money to build this. It now sits in the middle of a giant high school built by CBJ Snyder, and we'll hear more about Snyder later. And it was in use for years as for after-school activities and for the alumni group. The city decided it wasn't going to keep it up anymore, moved everybody out, and it sat there getting pretty damaged. And it just struck me that they must still teach high school history in high school. And if children looked out the window, they'd see how the city thought of its history, not too much. So amazingly enough, then Borough President Eric Adams was at a meeting at the main high school. And he asked about the building and got a tour. And realizing its importance, he put up all the money to restore the exterior. And here it is. So it's just one of those wonderful buildings that if it were in, New York is so large and we have such riches. If this were in a smaller town, it would be the pride of everybody. But here, thank goodness, there's local people looking after our treasures. This is also in Brooklyn. We're at Weeksville and Brownsville. Weeksville was one of the earliest free Black settlements in the country. Several hundred families lived here, and it started before the Civil War. They had their own newspaper, one of the earliest African-American newspapers in the country. They had schools, they had churches, they had a doctor. They were business people, farmers, etc. And the inexorable street grid started coming along. So a lot of people moved, and it came down to finally 4 little wooden frame houses that remained. But they were discovered by professors at Pratt, and the community was alerted. They adopted the buildings, got them landmarked, and they sit along what is known as Hunterfly Road, which was once a Native American trail. And so you have a little historic road and these little houses. And we have given grants for probably almost 40 years periodically to maintain these homes. And just last week, we finished their summer house. One of the houses built a little platform in the backyard and had netting all around it. And so they could sit outside in the summer and not catch mosquitoes. And Weeksville now uses it for a lot of their food programs. The city helped build this center for Weeksville, and there are offices and exhibition spaces there. And we had a meeting there last year with about a dozen local African-American organizations from the different boroughs, because people think of Harlem, of course, but there's a rich African-American history spread throughout the boroughs. So we've given grants to all the groups that were there, and they wanted to get to know one another, see if they could help publicize one another, and again, let more people know about their organizations and the riches of African-American history throughout the city. Now we're back in Manhattan, one of my other very favorite places. This is the Morris Jamel Mansion. It was built in 1765, and it is the oldest residence in Manhattan. Mr. Morris, or Colonel Morris, went back to Britain during the Revolutionary War and left the building. And Washington used this for several weeks as his headquarters as he fled up Manhattan after the Battle of Britain. This is on about the highest point in Manhattan. And in those days, you could see down both rivers as far as the harbor. So it was a great vantage point for him. After he was president, he brought the cabinet here for dinner. So when I stand in that main hallway, it's just astounding to me to think of Washington and his cabinet in those rooms. If that isn't enough, the next people who own the house, the Jamels, Monsieur, I can't speak French. Mr. Jamel was French and went back and forth to France and brought a lot of French furniture with him. After he died, his wife married Aaron Burr, who lived in the house for about a year until she had it with Aaron Burr. And in this wonderful stroke, hired Hamilton's son as her divorce attorney. And Madame Jumel went on to be one of the wealthiest businesswomen in America. There's a whole other story about her exploits, and it's quite a story. And then, if all that wasn't enough, Lin-Manuel Miranda came and sat in Burr's bedroom to get inspiration for his play, Hamilton. So this is a fabulous house. And we've given a lot of grants for exterior work. But a couple of years ago, I got a call out of the blue from the head of the Versailles Foundation. And they normally raise money for Versailles. But the president asked me if there was some French-themed place in New York that they could help. So we brought them right up, and they paid for the entire restoration of all the French furnishings, carpets, and drapes in the mansion. And they were so happy with that that they are now helping to restore the original kitchen. So I totally encourage you to visit this house, which I think is just an amazing survivor, and kind of soak up that history of who was there before you. This is Mother AME Zion. This is the oldest AME congregation in America and was founded in 1796, obviously in Lower Manhattan. And it moved into this building in 1925. It was designed by George Foster Jr., one of the early African-American architects. And it was built like a theater. This is Reverend Boyd, a tape that I did of him. And it's kind of in the round. And when it was built, most African-Americans couldn't get into theaters. And in those days, you couldn't get into the Apollo. So they have had all kinds of famous jazz concerts here. And it still has a wonderful, wonderful organ and music program, and a wonderful little museum in the basement of the building's history. And Reverend Boyd is a great believer in preservation, and appreciates that the city and people understand how important the history of Harlem is. And here we are at PS 109 on East 99th Street. This was designed by C.B.J. Snyder in 1901. C.B.J. Snyder was superintendent of buildings from about 1895 to 1920s. The authors of a book on C.B.J. Snyder are here tonight, so feel free, if I'm slipping over the dates, to correct me. This was the Conservancy's introduction to Snyder's incredible work. Snyder was there at a time when waves of immigrant children were coming into America. He built a couple of hundred schools, and he made them beautiful. This is one of his H-block plans. Schools used to be indistinguishable from like a brownstone next door. He created H-plan so that there was air and light in all the spaces. And he told the students through his architecture that education was important and they were important. And these were beloved schools in all the communities. But the city, in its wisdom, shut this school and combined the students with another one. And the community was very upset. And after they got the students out, the city started to demolish the building. And we got calls and went up. And I'm not an architect, but you didn't need to be to see what an incredibly built structure this is and how beautiful it is. So we called the State Preservation Office and asked if the city had talked to them about doing this, because the city was using public money. This building was clearly eligible for listing on the National Register. And so they should have checked with the state. They didn't. The state stopped them from tearing it down. And so the city just left it there where it sat for years. And finally, a group based in Minnesota goes around the country looking for spaces where they can create moderate and low-income homes for artists. And they finally found PS 109. There are space for artists at moderate prices throughout the building, and community space now on the ground floor. We became C.B.J. Snyder devotees. and have encouraged the city to care for his buildings. They've destroyed some, and they take excellent care of others. But he's one of these really unsung heroes who really did a lot for New York at a time when education mattered. Actually, reading the book almost depressed me, because when he was there, education was so important for the cities. These schools were just top notch. People came from Europe to study how we taught. They were opened at night, and they had programs for parents. They had English classes. They had all kinds of different classes. They were really community centers, and in many cases among the most beautiful buildings in their neighborhoods. We carry on the torch for CBJ and encourage the city to keep his buildings maintained. And now we're at Moynihan Train Hall, otherwise known as the Farley Post Office, built in 1914, one of the largest post offices in the country. 8,000 people once worked in this building round the clock. But we stood there with Senator Moynihan all those years ago when he first proposed turning this into a train hall for Amtrak. Moynihan everybody was aggrieved with the loss of Penn Station. He was particularly aggrieved. And he encouraged the railroads to look at this building, particularly Amtrak, as a new headquarters. He would not have been surprised, as the politician that he was, that it took so long to do this, but it's finally opened, and it's a beauty. We actually helped save these trusses. The first plan called for a huge dome skylight, and they thought the trusses were going to be in the way, but an engineer who's on our board showed them how, even if they wanted to raise the trusses, it could happen. In the end, they're there, and they're a wonderful characteristic reminding you of the history of the building. Which brings us to across the street to the current Penn Station. And we are now, we stopped Madison Square Garden from going into the back of Farley all those years ago. And some people still criticize us for doing that. But the garden was so enormous and heavy that you would have had to brace the walls of Farley. You would have had to driven so many columns down among the tracks that you would be halting train traffic, trying to fit the volume and the weight of the garden in. So we led a huge campaign to defeat that. I think inertia defeated it, but I think we had something to do with it. And now, of course, the question is, what is Madison Square Garden going to do today? That's not our main interest. Our main interest is stopping the state from tearing down 6 blocks around Penn Station using eminent domain, overruling our local zoning laws for giant glass towers. Governor Cuomo announced the plan. Governor Hochul has kept it. And despite a lot of criticism and a lot of evidence that this may cost us federal funding if she doesn't get a real plan together, it's still kind of hanging on. So I consider this one of the gravest insults to the city in a long time. And there are a lot of groups who feel the same way, and voters who feel the same way. So we continue the fight. But it took years to get Moynihan, and we stuck with that. And whatever it takes to defeat Penn across the street, we'll do that as well. The Plaza Hotel, Henry Hardenberg, 1907, French Renaissance Chateau. Trying to think of the interior is 2005. So about 2004, the hotel was bought by an Israeli company who created a smaller hotel in one section, condos on the part of the building facing Central Park, and had plans to turn all the great public rooms into retail space. There was going to be stairs and elevators up to the grand ballroom. And I don't know if it was going to be men's shirts, women's lingerie, who knows? But it was a terrible idea and a terrible plan. And we worked with a number of groups to encourage the city to landmark the great interior spaces, great public spaces of the plaza that hold so many kind of collective memories. And they finally did in 2005. The Israeli company's daughter, the head Israeli company's daughter, was an architect. So they put her in charge of restoring the rooms once they were landmarked. And they were so proud of the work they did that they gave us a party and put out an enormous book celebrating themselves for all their good effort. But we're certainly glad they did. And the rooms are still amazing. They could still use more use, but they're there for the public to enjoy. We once owned the Picasso curtain, the largest Picasso artwork in America. And this hung in the Four Seasons restaurant in the hall between the two dining rooms. And Philip Johnson, who was on our board, found this. It was Picasso painted this in 1919. His wife Olga danced at the Ballet Russe, and she's depicted in here. And it was once a larger curtain. It was cut down, but it absolutely perfectly fit this space within the Four Seasons. The Four Seasons became an interior landmark, but the commission did not landmark the curtain, figuring that it could just be taken off the wall. So there were several owners after the Seagrams who built it, Seagram company who built it, sold it, and a French company was there, and they were selling the building and selling off the artwork. And they were convinced to give us the Picasso so that we would care for it and keep it there as long as the restaurant was an interior landmark. So we had curators from the Metropolitan Museum assess it. Then we hired a curator who cleaned it and inspected it for us for several years. But the then owner of the building wanted us to take the curtain down so that he could show rotating art there, and suggested that we loan the curtain to an exhibition in Germany. The last time this curtain was off the wall was sometime in the 80s, and there was a backing on it that took the weight off the curtain itself. It was hung with the backing, but it had stiffened through the years. So all the curators were terrified that in order to move this, you roll it around a giant roller, that it would crack and fall apart. So we resisted the owner's attempts to move. Finally, he announced that he was just going to move it himself one weekend, and we took him to court. And I'm getting carried away with this story because I got so carried away trying to save this curtain. But he had two high-paid law firms, and we had a board member, a very good attorney who lent us his firm pro bono. And we went off to try to get a stay so he couldn't move the curtain. And the only court in session that day happened to be a divorce court. And so they finally said, okay, you can come in. And people were furious. But the judge decided that he was not going to be the judge that killed off a Picasso. So he halted the divorce proceedings, and the attorneys are going back and forth. And I'm sitting in back, and I'm going, because I figure I can make all these arguments too, more impassioned than our attorney. And I'm waving away. And this man next to me turns to me and said, shut up. You know, they're not going to pay attention to you. So I sat there, and in the end, the judge did put a stay on it. And so I'm bouncing up and down in joy, and I'm crying. And he says to me, who are you? And I tell him, and I say, who are you? And he said, I'm a guy trying to get divorced. So anyway, it had always been our goal. We continued in court, and I think we would have won, but the building owner told the restaurant he wasn't going to renew their lease. And that was our rationale for trying to keep it there. So then the quest became, where can we get it to in New York so that it could still stay Picasso's curtain? And to our delight, the Historical Society called one day, and it fits perfectly on their second floor. In order to move it, we spent an entire night from 11 on a Saturday night to 2:30 the following Sunday. We had special scaffolding in the restaurant. We had 22 workers, and we had the slowest roll of an artwork you have ever seen. But I was so proud of that piece because it didn't break. And the owner of the building had to pay for moving it, restoring it, and then getting it to the Historical Society. And it looks so much better there, actually, all cleaned with a wonderful background. And the Historical Society is now eventually going to have a new wing by Robert A.M. Stern. And they have a special place. So when you walk in the new wing, there's a special place just for the Picasso. So it was a little strange for a preservation group, but we were very happy to do it. Speaking of survivors, this is the survivor staircase from Ground Zero. This was originally in the northwest section of Ground Zero, and hundreds of people saved their lives running down the stairs that day. And the stairs were not damaged in the attack. They were perfectly intact. And this, when they took down the rest of Ground Zero, they left the casement with the stairs because it below the stairs led to a subway. So we thought that as the last remaining above ground section of Ground Zero, the stairs should just stay in place. Everybody else hated this idea. The electeds hated it. Larry Silverstein hated it. The Port Authority hated it. We finally heard from someone who worked for then Governor Spitzer, whose family were Holocaust survivors. And he was the top advisor to the governor. So the survivor staircase resonated with him. So he said, if you can get those stairs out of the concrete and get them to where the Memorial Museum is going in the museum will take them. So we hired Robert Silman, who was the premier preservation architect of his day. And he figured out, he cut them out of the concrete. He formed a special carrier to keep them in place. And this is the Port Authority on a very windy December morning with a giant crane getting ready to lift these up. And by this time, even the Port Authority guys were cheering as it was carried across an empty space and deposited where the museum would go. And there they are next to the main staircase. And you can listen to audio recordings of people whose lives were saved that day. So another very, it was very moving. And after 9/11, it felt good to be doing something for the city. So we also looked at the area around Ground Zero because the mayor had great plans for all kinds of changes in Lower Manhattan. And we did a study of all the eligible buildings for National Register nomination. And here on Broadway, the Port Authority, the MTA was going to tear down an entire block for the new Fulton Transit Center. But at the southern end on John Street was this building, the Corbin Building. And it was designed by Francis Hatch Kimball in 1889 and was an early skyscraper in its day. And he had a very early use of ornamental terracotta. The building, the time we were looking at it, was brown and filthy. And you can see what a beauty it became. So we had this huge campaign to save the Corbin Building. Corbin himself was head of the Long Island Railroad, and he died in a carriage accident when his horse tipped over the carriage. And it was a front page obit in the New York Times. So he was a big deal in his day. The Collegiate Church owned this building when we went in, and we said to them, we want to save this Corbin Building. And they had no idea what the Corbin Building was. Everybody had forgotten about Austin Corbin. But they were willing. And we got a Times editorial in support. We got a lot of elected officials in support. So the MTAs finally agreed. They restored the building. It is an absolute beauty. And you can go through the ground floor to get into the transit center. And it is a wonderful example of the new and the old together. And oops, we're on to Ellis Island. So now we're on to the south side of Ellis Island. When the Ellis Island Museum was completed, everybody thought Ellis Island was done. But the entire south side was abandoned. The federal government, as I mentioned earlier, in their want, just walked out and left all these buildings that was once the largest hospital complex of its day and a very up-to-date in terms of medical treatment in its day. So they saved a lot of the, well, the majority of immigrants who had to be held there for a while. And they cured pink eye. And pink eye used to send people back because it was incurable. When New York and New Jersey had a legal fight over where the southern part of Staten Island, Ellis Island was located, Jack Kerr, who's sitting in the back, is an expert preservation attorney, and he was on our board. And we intervened in a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court, where the dividing line was. And we lost, New York lost. And it was actually the best thing that ever happened to the south side of Ellis Island, because New York was not investing in it. But New Jersey was so happy and proud to have part of Ellis Island that then Governor Christie Whitman formed a group called Save Ellis Island, dedicated to the south side. And we have had a board seat on it ever since. And the idea is not, they're totally restoring a few of these buildings, but basically the buildings are stabilized. And Save Ellis Island leads hard hat tours through the south side, which are very moving. I mean, the Immigration Museum is fabulous, but when you are in one of these isolation wards and you could see the statues through the window, you just think of these terrified people wondering if they're ever going to get to America. And this hospital got most of them to America. So it's a wonderful place. So before New Jersey got involved, we actually did condition surveys on all the buildings on the south side with Conservancy staff and volunteers. And we stabilized one of the buildings ourselves to show the Park Service that it could be done for a reasonable amount of money. We contacted family groups, historical societies, and preservation groups across the country initially, and we all lobbied Congress and got some initial funding for it. And now this group has been in charge of the South Side for several years and is doing a lot with education and these hard hat tours. This is the Federal Archive building. It was built in 1894 on Greenwich Street. And once again, the federal government, when they decided they had no further use for it, walked out and left it. Senator Moynihan, another great friend, worked with us. And since we had worked on the Custom House, the General Services, I'm getting the GSA, the General Services Administration, hired the Conservancy to try to find a new use for this building. And we eventually did. We did an RFP, we found a developer. Most of it is residents, and there's some commercial on the ground floor. And under the federal law of the time, this could be sold for $1 if you put proceeds back into community use. And there was a man on our board who was both an attorney and an architect who came up with the notion of a revolving loan fund for preservation. So for years, we got a percentage of proceeds from both the residential and commercial side of this that eventually developed into a $9 million revolving loan fund. We now get just some from the commercial, and we've raised money ourselves. And this is now about a $12 million revolving loan fund I believe the largest revolving loan fund for preservation in the country. We have helped over about 290 different buildings. We were giving loans in Harlem. We were giving loans in parts of Brooklyn when it was difficult to get conventional financing there. We continue to try to look for moderate income homeowners, nonprofits, religious institutions, businesses throughout the boroughs. And now we're back almost where we started, at the Francis Tavern block, which is just a couple blocks away from the Custom House. And this is one of, outside of the seaport, this is the only place you can see what early Manhattan looked like. Francis Tavern itself is kind of a recreation of the original, but there's some original material in here. And this is where Washington bade farewell to his troops after the Revolutionary War. And there's a museum on the top floors and a restaurant below. The rest of the buildings had been sold to a developer who was going to tear them down. And the Conservancy, which is very young group, got involved. And we always had a great patron with Mrs. Astor. And Mrs. Astor gave the Conservancy the money to buy these buildings from the developer. And then we sold them to another developer who promised to keep them. We put easements on them so that we had the right to inspect and, if necessary, take the owner to court to keep them properly maintained. And then they're all now city landmarks as well. Again, a fledgling group who tackled the long haul projects. So that is our trip through the boroughs. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
What extraordinary work. The amazing accomplishments of the Landmarks Conservancy. And we so appreciate you sharing with us, sharing these wonderful things with us. We'll now take some questions. And I also want to remind the online audience that please, if you'd like to submit type questions, we'll be happy to take them as well.
Good evening. As a member of the Roosevelt and Bound families, I applaud your work. Another descendant of John Bound was Abraham Lincoln. And I would like to personally invite the Conservancy to become a participating organization with regard to New York City's 400th birthday celebration, which is coming up starting next year. My name is Charles McKenzie, and I'm on the board of the New York Quadricentennial Committee, and our website is going to be ny400th.org, which will be up in the next 30 days or so. And many of the historical museums and heritage groups are becoming participants, and we would greatly value your participation as well.
Thank you. We appreciate the invitation.
Bless you and your board and all the work that you do. Thank you. Is there anyone who's an heir to the tradition in government? Is there any Moynihan?
Moynihan is the exception to the rule that no one is just irreplaceable. He is irreplaceable. In New York City, Gail Brewer, who was the Manhattan Borough President and is now back in the City Council, has always been pretty good on preservation. Liz Kruger, Brad Hoylman have been good on preservation. But Moynihan lived and breathed it and understood it and knew all the buildings that needed to be saved, himself. He would point out things like the marine terminal at the tip of Manhattan, where you get boats to Governor's Island. He was pointing that out years ago as something that needed reclamation, a city-owned building, and it eventually was. So we have friends, but we never have, well, I don't know if we'll ever have a patron like Moynihan.
I'm going to take a couple of the online questions. This is from Jacqueline Ottoman. And first of all, she says, thank you for all your work and commitment to NYC's architectural treasures. I personally love the meatpacking district. Have you done any preservation work in that area?
We have supported landmarking of buildings. We have spoken against inappropriate additions to the buildings. But I don't think we've given a loan or grant there, but we've been active as an advocate for the area.
Right. Over here.
Thank you. Oh, thank you.
Hi, first of all, as a born and bred New Yorker, thank you for everything you do.
Mhm.
And I'm just wondering, I go to visit family in Long Island and I pass by that Hotel Pennsylvania and it just breaks my heart. And I understand now that it's being demolished as we speak.
Mhm.
What is this? Were you involved with trying to save it?
Yes.
And
yes.
is there any hope for saving any part of it now that the governor's plan for that Midtown West is kind of on hold or hopefully not going to be able to be happening?
I'm afraid not, because Renato has owned the Hotel Pennsylvania for a long time. We pleaded with the Landmarks Commission twice to get it landmarked. And we were told at the time that they considered this kind of a second tier McKinley and White. We think a second tier McKinley and White is still better than a lot of other things. But the commission in its wisdom declined to landmark it. And Steve Roth, the head of Renato, planned to tear it down years ago and build a giant tower. And I think the economics of that day stopped him. And I think now he's just frustrated enough that he's going to do something there. So no, it's a real tragedy. And actually, I'm an Upper West Sider, and I happened to go into Good Old Things one day on Upper Broadway, and they had fireplace surrounds, and they had other things in the Hotel Pennsylvania already. So I think it's a real loss. And the Times' Dan Barry did a wonderful story about, the memories it holds and what a fabulous place it was. And it's on its way out.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
There's,
sorry.
Just a very quick question about the Bown House, and
Mhm.
maybe you could answer this,
Yeah.
but did you say it was built in 1661?
yes,
So it was in the family for 300 years, but it
Mhm.
became a museum in 1947. So I was wondering, was the family living in the,
yeah.
is there any
That's what's so
interesting story or no? Okay,
Mhm.
that's all.
Yeah.
Thank you. Another online question. This is from Edward Morris. Many parts of the country have beautiful historic buildings, but don't have the institutional knowledge of the New York Landmarks Conservancy. Is there an online resource or a book list that lists groups in the hinterland that can refer to for best practice?
Well, obviously, there are a lot of good preservation groups throughout the country. Most of them are advocacy groups. There are some in New Orleans, Pittsburgh, and a few other places that have financial or technical programs. But most are advocacy, but they're very dedicated to their areas. There's a group called the, I don't know if there's one online place to go, but pick a city you're interested in and put in, preservation organization. And if there's not one in that local city, there's probably a statewide. So, we're out there and working on all kinds of preservation in cities large and small.
Thank you. Hopefully many Many groups nationwide are inspired by your example.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm not sure if this is your wheelhouse. I read an article in the New York Times recently about when they're taking down buildings in Manhattan, that the effect of that deconstruction affects old buildings down the block and they become compromised and fall down.
Well, you know, there's an example of that now. With an older building being taken down on Lower Fifth Avenue for new construction. And a building not adjacent, but the next one over, had to move the residents out because of cracks. And we actually have become very aware of several buildings under different circumstances, that they might be under construction or poorly maintained, that have either, you know, been demolished or have had issues. And the Landmarks Commission has been working on this as well. And I know that they are looking at how they can beef up their inspection and their enforcement. And the preservation groups in New York, about 6 of us have met with ourselves. We've met with preservation engineers looking for any ways that might be practical. There are some limits on what the city can require, what an owner has to accept, what an adjacent building has to accept. It's more complicated than we thought when we first just said, go out there and you know, do some enforcement and save these buildings. But there's a lot going on that very topic right now. And I expect to hear from the Landmarks Commission pretty quickly about, you know, what they're doing and what their plans are.
Several of the buildings that you showed this evening are city-owned historic houses, mostly under the jurisdiction of the Parks Department, but some under the jurisdiction of the Department of Cultural Affairs. And if you had showed others, in fact, we would have seen very similar severely deteriorated conditions at most of these houses, I believe, including some that aren't actually house museums like Litchfield Villa in Prospect Park, which is one of the grandest houses in the city. I'm wondering, I know that the Conservancy has stepped in periodically with emergency grants. I'm wondering whether you can think of any more global approaches that might be taken to improve the level of maintenance and stewardship of these buildings, which is really about as poor or non-existent as it could be. Thank you.
Well, there are a couple of things. One, I mean, you know, if the Parks Department had its druthers, if the Historic House Trust had its druthers and had its budget, you know, they'd be caring for these and more quickly than they can be now. One of the problems is our budget process, our capital budget process. There are instances where local council members will put money in for these various homes. And Morris Jamal Mansion, somebody put in money to paint this probably 8 to 10 years ago. I've lost track of time. And it's just starting to get painted now, and not actually painted, but they're working on it. It can take so long to wend through the budget process. And then the budget process doesn't believe or doesn't accept that, say, something like painting is maintenance. It's something the houses should be doing themselves. But a lot of these houses are, I think they do a lot of work. They try to do a lot in their community, but you know, they're trying to raise money for the interiors, and it's really Parks and Historic House Trust that are supposed to be on maintaining the exterior. I think there's a lot of will to do it, but these aren't the top budget priorities when the mayor and the council are gathering. And when the council does say, put in the money, it can take forever to wind its way through. So there's been The Adams administration has had a group working on the capital budget to see how they can speed things up. The Historic House Trust is getting new people in. And it's not that they don't want to do it, you know. And there are so many problems and issues in New York City. And we're saying, well, you know, you should really save this home because George Washington was once here. And in the scheme of all the issues going on, it can get lost. And yet I think these are really important buildings to have. Because again, it's our identity and our history and a sense of perspective. And so the more we can all do to let our public, our elected officials know that the homes in your area matter, or the homes in general of the Historic House Trust matter, the better it will be. And in the meantime, we keep giving emergency grants.
And we are so grateful for that. I'm going to conclude the Q&A, but I am just going to add a point of information as regards to national resources on historic preservation. And it was suggested by a member of the audience that the National Trust for Historic Preservation, of course, also works to preserve historic buildings across the country and probably would have some terrific resources. But talking of terrific resources, Peg, I just want to extend our thanks to you again to really see the amazing accomplishments of the Landmarks Conservancy and the difference that the organization has made to preservation and restoration in New York City, and we are all very grateful.
Well, I am very grateful because I've always had a fabulous board of people who care about the city and incredible staff people who have a lot more knowledge about these buildings than I do and are incredibly dedicated. So to a board and staff.
To the board and staff of New York Landmarks Conservancy, thank you so much. Thank you. Victoria, would you like to say a few words?
Just a few more words, Peg. I'll get a little more personal in terms of you. I'm a native New Yorker who's very appreciative of your work, but also your work style. And I do have to say this, and I rarely comment so personally, but you're graceful, intelligent, effective, passionate, and powerful. But a lot of people are, you could say they're powerful in their offices because of it. It's a persona, but you're powerful because you embody incredible traits that really are very unique, that they're all in one. So thank you, because a good organization takes a great leader to pull it all together. So, and Peg, you know, watching you over the years, really, it's just so interesting the way you have your mind everywhere. And I love that you're so direct in your style, but you still use the word love. Because if anybody didn't notice, we did get a Valentine from the Landmarks. You're the only one. They sent an email with Valentine's wishes. And I thought that was great that you did that. So I just want to give you a little memento from the society. We don't have many of these left, but I want to give one to you. It was from our 25th anniversary. So it is a scarf that Marisol DeLuna designed, and it's elements of our building. So it's a beautiful. And we want you to have it. All right, Peg, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to our audience. We love you too.
And we'll see you on our 230th anniversary.
Absolutely. I want to extend our thanks to Peg again for her wonderful presentation, and to the Landmarks Conservancy, to New York Landmarks Conservancy, to you, our audience, to both in person and online. Thank you as always for your support. I do want to mention our next lecture in 2 weeks is on the history of linoleum. And followed by that on, I believe it's Thursday, April 6th, we'll have a talk on Riverside Park. So I do hope you will come back for that. Thank you so much again. And I hope again for the in-person audience, please join us for a glass of wine. Thank you so much.